survey-based data like AAII.
Good morning. The subcommittee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recesses of the subcommittee at any time. We welcome everyone to this morning's oversight hearing entitled Fentanyl Analogues, Perspectives on Class-Wide Scheduling. I want to take the opportunity at the outset to express my condolences to Mr. Homeland for the tragic loss of his son. As someone who knows that particular type of pain, I give you my condolences. Your presence here is a stark reminder that we do indeed need to find a way to stem the tide of drug addiction and deaths by opioid overdose. But we also must do it in a responsible way, and that's based on scientific analysis and proper public health responses. And as members of the judiciary, we also have a responsibility to ensure that we protect people from dangerous drugs like fentanyl, but don't put systems in place that perpetuate incarceration. Our country faces an opioid crisis, including the incidences of overdoses involving fentanyl and fentanyl analogues. By some measures, more than 40% of heroin-related deaths in recent years involved some level of fentanyl. In 2017, the drug overdose crisis tragically claimed the lives of over 70,000 of our fellow Americans. Many died from overdoses. In a disturbing trend, illicit drug manufacturers, particularly in places like China, have found ways to change the composition of fentanyl-related substances to avoid or postpone the control and prosecution of these substances in the United States. Because of these dangers, 2 years ago, the DEA placed fentanyl analogues temporarily on Schedule 1 of the Controlled Substances Act, an administrative action that will expire February 6. Schedule 1 controlled substances are substances that have no currently medical accepted use and a high potential for abuse. Because of this and the risks of diversion, research is significantly restricted when a drug is on Schedule 1. Research licenses from DEA are difficult to obtain and maintain. Now that we are approaching the deadline, there is a concern from many that banning the entire class of fentanyl-related substances, especially on a permanent basis, could in fact significantly restrict important and valuable research into substances that could in fact be beneficial, such as overdose antidotes and treatments for opioid addiction. We want to make sure that our response does not undermine the indispensable role of our public health agencies. The Department of Health and Human Services is critical in promoting treatment responses and medically and scientifically assessing drugs, including those like fentanyl analogues that are on Schedule 1. Because some substances that are chemically similar to fentanyl could be found to be medically helpful, we have to think about the medical and scientific research of fentanyl analogues. This research, which is necessary for the development of new treatments and also antidotes for overdoses, must continue. So including a class-wide placement of such analogues into Schedule 1 of the Controlled Substance Act could lead to research delays and could be a disincentive to engage in this research in the first place. We also have to make sure that it doesn't cut into the Department of Health and Human Services processes that determines whether or not drugs placed on Schedule 1 are in fact harmful. HHS's critical role of analyzing drugs and making evidence-based recommendations helps ensure the integrity of the scheduling process and helps anchor policy decisions in scientific analysis. I am, of course, very concerned about the need to provide law enforcement with tools to battle this serious issue in our communities, but I also have a concern of a complete criminal justice response to the crisis. I'm concerned that addiction is a health issue, and rather than relying solely on incarceration, we need to also focus significantly on treatment. Under current federal sentencing guidelines, many defendants who are not high-level traffickers may be unnecessarily subjected to mandatory minimums that in fact become life sentences. I want to make sure that we don't repeat what we've done in past epidemics, which is the over-criminalization of an addiction and making sure that we put adequate resources into prevention, intervention, and treatment. So our approach to this issue, I also believe, should reflect the growing bipartisan recognition that we must do some reforms, such as those in the First Step Act, which included modest reforms to begin addressing the crisis of incarceration. I also want to make sure that we don't expand the scope of mandatory minimum sentences. We must consider the appropriate use of other mechanisms that give the Justice Department the ability to hold traffickers of analogs responsible without using the temporarily scheduling authority. For instance, we should discuss the appropriate use of the Analog Act, the mechanism already provided in the law that allows the Justice Department to prosecute the trafficking in analogs without use of overbroad class-wide scheduling. I'm encouraged by recent reports that China has been cracking down on its manufacturers of illicit fentanyl and fentanyl-related substances, and I'm hopeful that these efforts will curb the supply of these substances, but we need to also address the problem here in the United States. The temporarily extension of DEA order concerning fentanyl analogs and the more permanent solutions that have been proposed require careful consideration. Today, we have the opportunity to discuss these issues with government representatives and subject matter experts so that we may consider how we should proceed in forming a long-term strategy to stem the tide of this public health epidemic. I now yield to the ranking member of the subcommittee.
I thank the chair, and I ask unanimous consent to submit the statement of the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Collins, into the record.
Without objection.
I thank Dr. Giroir and Ms. Liscam, our witnesses, for being here today. During the rise of the opioid crisis, amidst the many lives lost in its wake, law enforcement found that the challenge to cracking down on the supply of synthetic opioids like fentanyl analogs was that drug traffickers could sell a slightly changed substance that did not fall under the existing schedule of the Controlled Substances Act. In February of 2018, the Drug Enforcement Administration, under President Trump's watch, used its authority to ban all fentanyl substances by placing them into Schedule I of the Controlled Substances Act. By that decision, criminals would now face the consequences of the destruction they have left throughout our country. However, under existing law, the Drug Enforcement Administration is only allowed to use its emergency regulatory powers to ban all fentanyl substances for 2 years. After that, it could be extended for at most 1 year after consultation with the Department of Health and Human Services. You would think that the least this Congress could do is to extend the scheduling of fentanyl under the Controlled Substances Act indefinitely. A proposed bill, the Stopping Overdoses of Fentanyl Analogues Act, is supported by attorneys general in all 50 states. This isn't a conservative issue. It's not a liberal issue. It's not a rural issue or an urban issue. If the Attorney General of Texas and the Attorney General of California can find common ground on this issue, the very least we could do is act on this issue. But instead, we are racing toward an expiration of the ban on fentanyl analogs simply because Congress is unwilling to act. This is entirely preventable. Congress had a chance during the last year's appropriations debate to include a measure empowering the DEA to keep the ban on fentanyl and fentanyl-related substances indefinitely. It failed. According to a Washington Post editorial, it appears that the reluctance with giving the DEA this essential authority may be due to the concerns of some in Congress about sentencing guidelines. I think the reason we haven't heard any public opposition from members about this is that, quite frankly, it's hard to publicly stand up and oppose extending the scheduling of fentanyl analogs. It's crazy to think that the reason we're in this position is that some in Congress are concerned that convicted drug traffickers would spend a little extra time in jail. A concern about the amount of time drug traffickers spend behind bars is a difficult explanation to give to the families of people who have died from drug overdoses. But yet here we are. Next week, the scheduling of fentanyl analogs expires. I urge my colleagues to put partisan politics aside and put the needs of our constituents and the American people first. Some may think that a public health approach is the best way to solve the opioid crisis. Some think that providing law enforcement with the tools to hold suppliers and traffickers accountable is the best way to solve this issue. But doing nothing, waiting until 1 week before the deadline to do something, is not the answer. The failure to act is a disservice to our communities. It's a disservice to our constituents. It's a disservice to the families of the victims who have lost their lives. I yield back.
We welcome our witnesses and thank them for participating in today's hearing. Now, if you would rise, I'll begin by swearing you in. Raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give is true and correct to the best of your knowledge, information, and belief? So help you God. Let the record show the witness has answered in the affirmative. Thank you, and you can please be seated. We will proceed with witness introductions, starting with the first panel. Admiral Brent Joua, is that right? Serves as Assistant Secretary for Health at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. As the Assistant Secretary for Health, he leads development of HHS's wide public health policy recommendation and oversees several of the department's core public health offices and leads many critical national initiatives, including a historic new plan to end the HIV epidemic in America and the physical activity guidelines for Americans. He is also responsible for coordinating HHS's efforts across agency to fight the opioid crisis. Amanda Liskin is the Director of Opioid Enforcement and Prevention Efforts in the Office of the Deputy Attorney General at the Department of Justice. As Director, she is responsible for assisting the Attorney General, Deputy Attorney General, and department components in formulating and implementing department initiatives, policies, grants, and programs relating to opioids and coordinating these efforts with law enforcement. Previously, she served as Deputy Chief of Litigation in Narcotic and Dangerous Drugs Section in the Department of Criminal Division. We will now start with the first panel. Please note that each of your written statements will be entered into the record in its entirety, and accordingly, I ask that you summarize your testimony in 5 minutes. To help you stay within that time, there is a timing light on your table. When the light switches from green to yellow, you have 1 minute to conclude your testimony. When the light turns red, it signals your 5 minutes have expired. Admiral, you may begin.
Chair Bass and Ranking Member Ratcliffe, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today about the opioid overdose epidemic, and specifically the role of fentanyl and fentanyl analogs in fueling that epidemic. As you said, I'm the Assistant Secretary for Health in the Department of Health and Human Services, and also the Senior Advisor to the Secretary for Opioid Policy. Between 1999 and 2018, over 770,000 people died of drug overdoses in our country, the majority of which were caused by opioids. And although 2018 witnessed the first decrease in overdose deaths in nearly 2 decades, still over 68,000 Americans died of drug overdoses, and over 47,000 of these were caused by opioids. In the first waves of the crisis, opioid deaths were predominantly caused by misuse of prescription opioids, heroin, or both. But in 2016, the predominant cause of opioid deaths became synthetic opioids, including fentanyl and chemical analogs of fentanyl, illegally manufactured and transported into our country either through international mail or smuggled across the border. And unfortunately, deaths caused by fentanyl and analogs are still increasing at approximately 10% annually. A significant factor that complicates enforcement against illicit fentanyl and analogs is that there are several thousand potent opioids that can be derived by chemical manipulation of the basic fentanyl structure. These are called analogs or derivatives. While some have been identified and undergone the formal process of scheduling as controlled substances, the power of modern chemistry has led to a deadly game of whack-a-mole, such that when an analog is identified and undergoes the process of scheduling, clandestine manufacturers are able to synthesize different, equally deadly molecules that evade enforcement, and at a much faster rate than they can be identified and undergo the rigorous process of scheduling. For this reason, HHS supports the permanent scheduling of fentanyl analogs as a class. But we also need protections and facilitation of critical research on these and other classes of molecules. Why research protections? Because certain analogs of fentanyl that would be scheduled in the class could potentially have profoundly important uses as new medicines, and we cannot put barriers to innovation, research, and development when tens of thousands of Americans die each year and nearly 2 million struggle with opioid addiction. So what are some specific examples of potential medical applications? Naloxone has saved tens of thousands of lives, but many of the new synthetic opioids overpower naloxone, causing patients to fall back into life-threatening overdose symptoms within an hour after administration. We need a much better version of naloxone, and that version may reside in the class of molecules we would schedule. Another example, the NIH is leading exciting and potentially transformational research using monoclonal antibodies that can effectively reverse even the most potent analogs and last for a month, not 30 minutes. How could scientists even test this new innovative medicine against fentanyl analogs if they don't have ready access to these analogs for research? Another example, medication-assisted treatment, or MAT, works substantially better than treatment without MAT, but still at least 40% of patients have a relapse into their opioid use disorder within 6 months. But an improved MAT drug might have a chemical structure included in the proposed scheduling. And finally, if we don't have protections that enable access to these analogs, we cannot develop clinical diagnostic tests to determine what analog caused an overdose. In short, we might not even know what is killing us. Currently, obtaining or modifying a Schedule I research registration involves significant administrative challenges that not only delay research, but deter many of the young and brightest scientists from entering the field, exactly the opposite of what America needs. These challenges impede critical research on Schedule I substances and deter or prevent scientists from pursuing their work. The good news is that HHS has worked closely with our colleagues at ONDCP and the Department of Justice and DEA on a plan that both supports the scheduling of the entire class of fentanyl analogs while allowing descheduling or reducing the schedule class based on scientific evidence, and several provisions to streamline research on Schedule I molecules. Details of the research issues are indicated in my written testimony, and I would be pleased to provide details in today's question period. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify today on this critically important public health topic.
Ms. Luskin?
Chairwoman Bass, Ranking Member Ratcliffe, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to discuss the Department of Justice's work to combat the opioid epidemic, the challenges our prosecutors face, and the expiration of DEA's emergency temporary scheduling order of fentanyl-like substances. As discussed before, I am the department's Director of Opioid Enforcement and Prevention Efforts. I have over 13 years of experience as a drug prosecutor, working both as an Assistant United States Attorney and as the Deputy Chief in the criminal section of the department, where I've prosecuted the most dangerous drug traffickers and cartels. I know drug traffickers, and I know that the deadly lengths that they will go to make money. As our nation faces unprecedented overdoses and deaths caused by opioids, the department is responding with every tool available. My position in the Deputy Attorney General's office was created to focus entirely on this issue, implement the department's initiatives and policies relating to opioids, and coordinate the efforts of our many components. Over the years, the demand for illicit opioids became more pervasive following years of overprescription of legal medications. Yet while the department and the nation have seen usage of controlled prescription drugs decrease, the number of overdose deaths in the United States has reached record levels. One of the chief causes is the proliferation of fentanyl, and relevant for today's hearing, of illicitly produced potent substances structurally related to fentanyl. Traffickers of these fentanyl-like substances specifically engineer them to skirt a coverage gap in U.S. drug control laws. And oftentimes, the first time we would learn of these new fentanyl-like substances was through a sudden rash of overdose deaths in our communities. This unprecedented threat called for unprecedented measures, and in February of 2018, DEA responded by scheduling the entire class of fentanyl-like substances on a temporary emergency basis. Since DEA's scheduling action, this gap has been filled. In response to the class-wide scheduling order, we've seen a significant decrease in encounters of fentanyl-like substances and a reduced production of these substances by traffickers. but DEA's emergency temporary scheduling action controlling all fentanyl-like substances will expire on February 6, 2020, absent further action by Congress to make it permanent. That's in just 9 days. If that gap in U.S. law controlling fentanyl-like substances reemerges, the Department and DEA fully expect drug traffickers to fill it and take the United States back to the even more deadly phases of this epidemic. I can personally tell you how savvy these drug traffickers are. When there's a gap in U.S. law, they take full advantage of it, which results in more drugs and more deaths. We've seen Chinese criminal organizations, Mexican cartels, and other traffickers push illicit fentanyl for its profitability and its potency. Permanent class-wide scheduling is the necessary step to counter these criminal organizations. From a legal perspective, class-wide scheduling alleviates DEA's cat-and-mouse game of emergency scheduling newly encountered fentanyl analogs substance by substance and gives law enforcement and prosecutors like me an efficient tool to bring these traffickers to justice. With DEA's temporary order, the United States became an international leader in addressing the emergence of fentanyl-like substances. The U.S. has engaged with many countries who are likewise facing these public safety challenges. Prompted in part by the urging of the United States, China announced the class-wide scheduling of fentanyl-like substances on May 1st of 2019, a significant step to alleviate the production in China and the influx of these poison substances in our communities. We must take action and make DEA's order permanent to ensure the United States is doing as much as China in responding to our own nation's opioid epidemic. To close, I want to reiterate the importance of this issue to the department and to me. As a prosecutor, I can tell you that a legislative solution for class-wide scheduling of fentanyl analogs is necessary. We are running out of time, and if a solution isn't found, prosecutors will undoubtedly be hindered and drug traffickers will undoubtedly be helped. There are many proposed solutions to counter the threat from fentanyl being debated, but permanent class-wide scheduling is a necessary step. We cannot afford to take a step backwards in our fight against fentanyl and other synthetic opioids. We are at a crossroads, and in just 9 days, we have a choice to make with dealing with this public health crisis. We can revert back to the reactive phase that we dealt with each substance on a substance-by-substance basis only after a rash of deaths in our communities. Or we can continue the class-wide scheduling, which has proven effective and is working in keeping this deadly poison out of our communities. Thank you for the committee's interest and attention to this important issue, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much. We will now proceed under the 5-minute rule with questions, and I'll begin by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. Admiral, I wanted to know if you could, in plain English, if you could describe a little bit about the process that you go through in determining a scheduling decision. So there's the 3-factor analysis for a temporary scheduling decision, and then there is an 8-factor analysis for a permanent decision. And I was wondering if you could explain a little bit about what that means.
Yes, ma'am. So traditionally, the DEA requests that the FDA does a scientific analysis based on a specific molecule that they're concerned about to potentially be put in a schedule according to the Controlled Substances Act. Without going into a huge amount of detail, there are 8 factors that should be considered by the law: the potential for abuse, the scientific evidence of its effect, the state of current scientific knowledge, history and current pattern of abuse, scope, duration, and significance of abuse, what, if any, risk there is to the public health, psychic or physiologic dependence, or whether it's an immediate precursor of another drug. So the FDA does its analysis based just on the evidence that's there. They make a recommendation actually to the ASH, the Assistant Secretary for Health, who is the designated official by the Secretary to make a recommendation to DEA. So after that process occurs, and this occurs on a regular basis for schedule, is we make a recommendation back to the DEA, and the Attorney General and his or her delegates make the decision on whether to schedule. And that's the basic process that's undergone.
And so the only way you know to do that is, I believe, what you were describing. There's a rash of deaths, and then you take that sample, it goes to you, and then you go through that factor analysis. Is that how that process occurs?
That's correct. Either these substances are seized by law enforcement, or we respond to a rash of death in the community, which is a more typical way that we encounter this, and we send that over to HHS.
And so you were explaining that with the permanent ban, you're still able to do that? What you described in your...
So the issue with the fentanyl analogs is we estimate there are over 3,000 of them within the class, any of which could be deadly, even more deadly than the ones we see right now. And the scientific evidence to try to look at 3,000 chemicals and try to do that, it's just not meant for what the process is meant to be. So our approach that we really came up with is, we know one thing for a fact, and that is 68,000 Americans are going to die of drug overdoses this year, the majority of which are from fentanyl and analogs, and we have to stop that. But we tried to put research protections. For example, if one of those 3,200 turns up to be not have potential for abuse or to be an important molecule for research, then we could rapidly deschedule or reduce the schedule so it can be available to researchers. And a number of other items like just streamlining some of the processes of inspection and clarifications that inhibit the process.
But, so you know if it's a problem by the deaths, but how do you know if it has the potential to have an advantage? I mean, I was shocked to hear what you said, that there are now analogs that are stronger than Narcan.
So this would be discovered by, it could be discovered anywhere in the world or by academic scientists that a particular compound that they're focusing on or investigating on might have an important effect. Remember naloxone, the reversal drug?
Yeah.
Looks a whole lot like morphine.
Right.
It was
called, is it still called Narcan?
Pardon, ma'am?
Narcan, is it?
Narcan, yes, ma'am. Narcan is a specific form, the nasal, but it looks a whole lot like morphine, but it has no effect. In fact, it reverses all those effects.
Right.
So it's certainly possible and likely, I would say, that among those 3,200 compounds, there are going to be some that are very, very interesting that could be reversal agents. And when I talked about overpowering naloxone or Narcan, it's drugs like carfentanil, the elephant tranquilizer that unfortunately is at least 100 times more potent than fentanyl. And although Narcan works, within a few minutes or 15 or 20 minutes, a new word that I learned from Dr. Volkoff is people become re-narcotized. They fall right back into their overdose because the naloxone is overpowered. So these are the kind of things that we really need to work on, particularly as the transnational cartels become more and more sophisticated in bringing these horrible analogs to us.
And so the analogs are created either in Mexico or China?
That's correct. What we've seen is a growing trend of chemists in Mexico who are working with these cartels, specifically the Sinaloa cartel and the CJ&G, to manipulate the chemical structure in order to create these analogs. And they will do anything they can to make profits and bring this poison into the country, which is why this tool is so necessary to the department.
Thank you.
Thank the chair. Ms. Liscombe, as a former DOJ alum, I thank you for your service and good work. From your testimony, you very clearly believe that the current ban is working. What would happen to the ongoing prosecutions of traffickers of fentanyl analogs if this temporary scheduling order expires next week on February 6th?
So we're going to have to look at those cases on a case-by-case basis to determine how we're going to handle them. It's going to create, at a minimum, a lot of legal uncertainty about whether we can still proceed forward under the current statute or whether we would have to turn back to prosecute under the Analog Act, which poses a whole host of issues, in, as I'm sure you may know, in trying to get a conviction against these individuals.
I was afraid that was going to be your answer, and I think it just underscores the urgency of the issue that we're facing. Dr. Giroir, actually, Admiral, when we crossed paths back in Dallas years ago, you were doctor, so congratulations on your promotion.
Thank you.
In your testimony, you described the different ways the basic fentanyl structure can be manipulated to create analogs, and that is a significant factor, I think you said, in how that complicates enforcement against illicit fentanyl and fentanyl analogs. I was particularly struck by your description of how the process of scheduling each individual analog under the Controlled Substances Act one at a time leads to what you referred to as a deadly game of whack-a-mole, where clandestine manufacturers are able to synthesize a different fentanyl analog to evade enforcement. Given all of that, is it your opinion, I think I know the answer, is it your opinion that permanent scheduling of fentanyl analogs will further efforts to combat the opioid crisis? And assuming that it is, can you expand in practical terms how that would be effective?
So let me reaffirm that HHS and I absolutely support the permanent scheduling of fentanyl analogs. Of course, as I testified, we would like to see, coincident with that, the research protections, because out of those 3,200 or so classes, compounds, there are going to be ones that are very important that we need to do research on. But as I said, we know tens of thousands of Americans will die this year, and we have to support DOJ's enforcement. Now, how does this really work? I think it has worked. As Ms. Liscam says, and we work together literally all the time to get the public health and the law enforcement working together simultaneously. We have to treat anyone who has opioid use disorder, but we've got to keep these substances from coming in on our streets as much as possible. And when there is a loophole, we see that manufacturing going up and we see overdoses because of those agents. So we are strongly supportive of DOJ trying to keep these off our streets, because addiction is treatable. That's the good sign, but it's really hard. Once you have a use disorder, it is a chronic brain disease. It is a lifelong struggle. So keeping these away from everyone in our country is the most important thing we can do. And of course, treatment is equally important for those who currently suffer.
Ms. Liscam, you want to expand on that at all?
The department takes research very seriously, and as Admiral Gerard said, we have been working in partnership to make sure that we can do everything that we can to combat this opioid epidemic. As an example, there's an Appalachian Regional Task Force that goes out and works to prosecute individuals in one of the hardest hit areas in the country, in Appalachia. And instead of just taking these, they're medical professionals who are charged with Title 21 offenses. Yes, we are taking them off the street, but we work hand in hand with HHS to deploy these rapid response teams to the area so that individuals who are seeking legitimate medical treatment or addicts who need assistance are not just left out in the cold and turning to street dealers. And it's been a really great collaboration between the two departments.
Well, I thank you both for your efforts in this vitally important issue, and with that, I yield back.
Ms. Dean.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I thank you for offering us this hearing today. As I sit here, Madam Chair, I'm hearing testimony, and do you ever have that feeling of both things are true? Both what you're talking about is importantly true. Both what you are talking about is importantly true. And I think it is our job as policymakers to figure out that place in between. How do we balance criminal justice appropriate behaviors while not harming the attempts for research? And so know that I come at it from that perspective, and I admire both Prosecutor Liscam and Admiral Giroux, the work that you're doing and how you bring this to us. The numbers are staggering. This is an issue I care deeply about. It's an issue that is closely connected to my community, to my own family. I have a son in recovery, 7 years, 3 months, from opioid addiction. So I have learned through our family experience of the real knowledge that this is a disease. This is a public health crisis. And I've seen how it has racked our communities. We have friends who have lost children and adults as well. I want to avoid the overcriminalization. I want to avoid the overuse of mandatory minimums where it is not appropriate. I want to protect the ability to do research. And so maybe I'll begin with you, Ms. Liscam, knowing that the opioid crisis takes more than 50,000 or up to 50,000 people a year as of 2018. 70,000 folks die of overdose in a single year. I call it a jetliner a day. It is staggering. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, 365 days a year. What is the best way for us to attack this problem? I worry that we will go for the low level, effectively go for low-level so-called traffickers, using resources to incarcerate and over-incarcerate, when really what we're dealing with often is addiction, the public health crisis. How do we more effectively, how does DOJ more effectively use our resources to go at the cartels, to go at the border, to make sure that that which is coming in from China or Mexico is not getting into our communities, because that's where our problem is.
Understood, and I appreciate all of those comments. I have to say that the department, again, is using every tool that we have at our disposal, and I think that if you look at the past 2 years since this order has gone into effect, since February of 2018, the results speak for themselves. The amount of fentanyl and analogs we see coming through the mail from China has dropped drastically. The number of fentanyl encounters that DEA has seen here in the United States since 2018 has dropped by 50%. It went from 17,500 to 8,800, which is...
What are those numbers reflecting? 17,000 what?
Encounters of fentanyl analogs. So before the order, DEA was seeing 17,500 examples of fentanyl analogs that were found here in the United States. Once that order went into effect, that dropped by 50%. That shows that it's working. And I just want to point also to, and we're very cognizant of the concern about overcriminalization, and that is not the department's goal here. And I think, again, pointing to the last 2 years, we have not seen a big uptick, and we have not seen overcriminalization bear out over the past 2 years. The department...
Could I just give you an example and ask your opinion of it? And I don't know what the answer is. I'm not presupposing what the justice was in this case. But in neighboring Bucks County, I'm from suburban Philadelphia, neighboring Bucks County, a young woman, now 24, 25 years of age, was incarcerated for 20 years imprisonment. She and her friend, sadly, were shooting heroin in a KFC. Emma left her friend to die in that bathroom at a KFC. Emma went on, and the death of the woman, trust me, it's just crushing and heartbreaking. She was only 20. It was her birthday. And her friend had shared drugs with her. Now, that friend, the one who survived, went on to recovery, to work in the area of addiction, but was sentenced to 20 years imprisonment. I don't know what justice looks like in that case. Do you have an opinion on mandatory minimums in that kind of a case?
So I don't know the underlying facts and why that case was prosecuted the way that it was. I know that in fiscal year 2018, the fentanyl prosecutions that we saw that year, we saw less than half of those fentanyl prosecutions were subject to the mandatory minimum. And then of those, about half of those had either a safety valve provision that they were eligible for. So if they were a low-level criminal history and they pled guilty, that would apply. Or those individuals pled guilty and cooperated with the government and were the 5K or Rule 35 substantial assistance was available to them.
I see my time is up, and unfortunately, in this case, under the statute in Pennsylvania, a new statute in Pennsylvania, that wasn't an option. And Admiral, I apologize. I would love to have asked you more questions. Maybe I can privately. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Before I begin, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to insert 3 items into the record. First, a Washington Post op-ed by Attorney General Barr, dated January 10th, 2020, saying we ought to pass legislation. Secondly, a letter from all of the attorney generals in the country, state attorneys general in the country, supporting legislation. And thirdly, an extensive report from Dr. Tim Westlake, who is a full-time emergency room physician in Oconomowoc, Wisconsin, who has been involved in this issue as a result of what he's seen in the ER in the hospital in which he works. So I ask unanimous consent that they be included. Now, Madam Chair and members of the committee, let me say what got me interested in this entire issue probably about 4 years ago. It was a constituent named Lori Badura. Her son died of an overdose. Dr. Westlake was the ER physician that saw her son go into the hospital and could not save him. So I introduced both in the last Congress and this one, the SOFA bill. It's an acronym. It's called Stopping Overdose of Fentanyl Analogues. Save Others Before Archie. Now we're talking about saving lives here. And unless the fentanyl analogues are scheduled the same way that fentanyl is scheduled, you are going to see the drug pushers use the analogues if the temporary order expires because they know they won't get prosecuted. And it's as simple as that. Now, nobody here wants to inhibit any type of research on how we can develop better antidotes on that. And there should be some kind of an exemption where government licensed research can be done. But to say that we shouldn't put fentanyl analogues under Schedule I, because if you're convicted of a fentanyl-related offense, you're subject to a mandatory minimum, and we shouldn't subject more people to a mandatory minimum, ends up saying that we ought to put our opposition to mandatory minimums ahead of saving hundreds of thousands of lives. If there ever were wrong priorities, that's it. You know, keeping people out of jail on a mandatory minimum and hundreds of thousands of people dying is no trade-off that should be acceptable to this Congress or to anybody else. And that's why the SOFA Act ought to be passed. It shouldn't be tweaking fentanyl a little bit so you get off the hook if you're pushing drugs. Then we ought to say that there's no scheduling of that, I think, is an argument that in the forum of public opinion will not stand up very long at all. So what should we do about this? We've got the temporary scheduling expiring next week. I wish we'd been able to do this sooner, but there's been opposition to doing this sooner from a whole lot of quarters. You know, it's time to realize that the opposition, while valid in a number of instances, is small in bringing forth the public good compared to saving all of these lives. I'm sure that the DEA will take the extra year that is given under the law, but it means that we have to pass the SOFA Act, maybe as amended, sometime this year through both houses and have it go to the president for signature. When are we going to put lives first? All of our civil rights laws are supposed to protect people's civil rights. I think the right to life is the paramount civil rights, because if you're not alive, all the other laws aren't going to mean anything when you're in the graveyard. So let's get on with doing the right thing. Let's pass the SOFA Act. Let's get it through the House and through the Senate and make sure by February 6, 2021, the law is such that it has no loopholes left. I yield back.
Ms. Mercarso-Powell?
Thank you, Chairwoman, for having this hearing. You know, I think that we all agree that we have a public health crisis in our hands, and the opioid epidemic has devastated thousands of communities across the nation. In Florida, I represent Southern Florida. In Florida alone, over 5,500 opioid-related deaths were reported in 2018. And a lot of these deaths are not only from use of heroin, but they are actually from fentanyl and analogs like you were stating now. And they're highly addictive substances which have deadly consequences. I actually toured an area in my district, Banyan Health Systems, that treat individuals that continue to come back for treatment because of these highly addictive substances. In 2018, there were at least 3,100 fentanyl and analog-caused deaths in my home state, a 35% increase from 2017. But we're unsure that this data is accurately measuring all the effects of fentanyl. Analogs are very hard to track, and especially when screening incidents of overdose, they are difficult to measure. So I wanted to hear directly from an ER doctor in our community. He works at Jackson Memorial Health System, which covers my district. And he's the medical director of the Florida Poison Control Center and the toxicologist for Jackson Memorial. He outlined the drastic increase in fentanyl-related overdoses that he's witnessed in recent years. He described to me that just 2 years ago, in one particularly bad day in the ER, he treated 16 fentanyl overdoses in just one shift alone. This is just one story from my community. I can tell you hundreds of stories similar to those. I wanted to start with Admiral Garor. I wanted to ask you, going back to Dr. Bernstein's story, why do you think it's so difficult to track fentanyl and analog-related deaths?
So I think, as you pointed out, we've invested over the last couple years with obviously the support of Congress, hundreds of millions of dollars from the CDC to support local testing laboratories. So in the past, you might not have been able to detect all the analogs. That's really changing very drastically and very rapidly. So we feel pretty good about our ability to detect. But what we don't want to see is, after the person dies, over 2 months for a medical examiner to be able to detect it. We really need to keep them out of the limelight of use to begin with. We're doing many things right now. For example, trying to do novel things, working together with DOJ, like getting anonymized, so we don't know who the patient is, but anonymized data from all over the country about urine drug screens at a very high level, so we could begin to start seeing in real time what fentanyl analogs or other substances are starting to invade a community. Mm-hmm. And again, we need to treat patients. It's a chronic brain disease. But if a new fentanyl analog comes around, the local public health department or emergency room may not know that. What if it's a very potent one and you reverse it, and that ER doctor says everything is good, but 30 minutes later, the person becomes re-narcotized and back into a coma? So these are the kinds of things we struggle with. And what you talked about, ma'am, that's happening every day all over the country. There's no question about that. Florida, ma'am, Pennsylvania, I was just visiting Pennsylvania, I was just visiting Florida.
And I do think that, this is part of it's a huge systemic problem, but we need to deal with supporting those individuals that have become highly addictive to these substances, because I don't think we do enough to support these centers that treat addiction. So, it's a whole chain and a whole system. I want to ask very quickly, and I wanted to ask the Department of Justice, Ms. Liscam, can you tell me what the mandatory sentence is for individuals and the amounts that they carry when you find someone and you convict someone?
Sure. So with respect to fentanyl analogs, and I'm glad you asked this because I think there's a misconception about what those thresholds levels are actually at. In order to get a 5-year mandatory minimum sentence, and doing the math, with just 2 milligrams of a fentanyl substance being a lethal dose, a 5-year mandatory minimum would require 5,000 lethal doses.
100 milligrams, correct?
Correct.
So, and that's like half a cup of fentanyl.
It is, I don't know how large it is, but 2 milligrams is
looking
like
at the
2
formulas.
grams or granulars of salt or something.
But when someone carries 100 milligrams of fentanyl, is that for personal use that you have found, or is it to distribute?
So we would have to look at the circumstances of the case. And that's one of the things that I think is so important to remember. Everyone keeps pointing to the fact that we have the Analog Act to fall back on. One of the prongs that the prosecutors must prove under the Analog Act is that something is meant for human consumption, which, in my experience, takes months of investigation in order to prove that this substance is being used for human consumption. We have wiretaps, we use confidential sources, undercover buys, as opposed to a package coming through the mail or stopping a load coming into the United States. The government is charged with proving beyond a reasonable doubt that that substance, that kilo of fentanyl crossing the border, is meant for human consumption, which is a large challenge for the prosecutors who are on the line prosecuting these cases every day.
And would you say that at the bottom of the distribution chain, those are the people that get convicted at high numbers?
No, I actually would disagree with that. The department is always trying to work those cases up and go after the Chapo Guzmans, the leaders of these cartels who are responsible for bringing all this poison into the country.
And what do you need from us?
We need permanent class-wide scheduling.
Thank you. I yield back.
Oh, Ms. Lesko.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. And first, before I ask any questions, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to place in the record a letter from the Major Cities Chiefs Association, which represents the police chiefs. Thank you. And in that letter, it specifically asked to support Senate Bill 3021 to extend temporary scheduling of the fentanyl class. And it also says if the current scheduling of the fentanyl class is allowed to expire, the United States risks opening itself up to a flood of new fentanyl analogues, as we've heard already. Specifically designed to skirt current law, these analogues are slight molecular variations of fentanyl, and despite being just as dangerous as traditional fentanyl, are technically new, non-scheduled, and non-controlled substances. Furthermore, if the scheduling of the fentanyl class lapses, the penalties for manufacturing, trafficking, and distributing fentanyl and its analogues will be severely diminished. Classifying the fentanyl class as a Schedule I controlled substance is a strong deterrent to criminals that should be maintained. And as others have said, at least on my side of the aisle, I wish we had done this sooner instead of waiting till the last minute. In Arizona, I represent Arizona, and just on January 22nd of this year, just the other day, the U.S. Border Patrol agents in my state seized more fentanyl on a man they arrested that had bags of fentanyl taped to his thighs. This is a fairly common problem, and as has been attested, either they're manufacturing these analogs in Mexico or China is shipping them to cartels in Mexico, and then they're being shipped across the Arizona border and other southern borders, and Canada, so I've heard. In Arizona, I used to be in the state legislature, and we tried to combat this because the opioid addiction is a huge problem there. We allowed naloxone to be given by pharmacists basically over the counter without prescriptions. It's also it's also prescribed along with opioids over a certain strength, I guess is the right word. And one of the, changing subjects a bit, one of the concerns that I have about not acting on this is what's going to happen with China. We convinced China to do this and go along and schedule fentanyl and they did so in May 1st, I think, of 2019. Now we're not going to do it here, and then, what message is that sending to China? I think this is a really bad move, and I'm really concerned, actually, for the lives of all Americans. One of the questions that I have for you, Doctor, is do you know of any specific cases where research has been hindered because of this class-wide temporary scheduling? Because that was one of the concerns that was brought up.
So I can't give you at this moment in time a specific name of a specific person particularly related to this, but we know that as a general rule, any substance in Class 1 requires a very significant, and I'm going to say, of course, we all have to balance the needs, right? Because we're worried about diversion, we're worried about people working with those investigators, but it requires a very significant period of time. On average, it could be about 100 days, but it can take up to a year. It's very complicated. When you want to use another substance or a different protocol, even for the same substance, it requires reapplication. If you move your laboratory to a different part of the campus, it's unclear whether that needs a whole separate registration or not. And if a lot of people work for you, as many of these groups do, it's very unclear still whether all of those need to be registrants as well. So what we did together, and again, we did work this together, is, and I want to be clear, HHS supports permanent scheduling of fentanyl analogs for all the reasons I said. We would like to see simultaneous or in the future the actions that we agreed upon to enable research to continue. because it is a problem with Schedule I drugs now, and it could be more of a problem as we schedule 3,000 as part of this class.
Thank you very much. I think I've gone over time, so I will yield back.
Ms. Jackson-Lee.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the witnesses. Good to see you, Dr. Guar and Admiral, and also as well to Ms. Liscam. Let me say that we have a sense of urgency that I know we are working on, and I thank this committee for convening this hearing. But let me make a few pointed statements and then raise questions with all of you. Fentanyl, of course, has been used to enhance other drugs, and it is deadly. I want to make that very clear. It has killed people. I have no opposition. It needs to remain on Schedule I. I hope we will move as swiftly as possible. But you must separate the two. You must give comfort to loved ones who have lost children, family members. Fentanyl, my recollection is, came out of China, or at least it's been used, and it's now proliferated here in a deadly manner. So I'm interested in, what you think are your tools that you need. But I do want to go on record that mandatory minimums have never helped anything. It hasn't solved any problems. And I will not cede to that. What I will cede to is what I did when we were discussing and passing legislation in the last two Congresses on the issue of drugs. I made note of the point that the rise in empathy for opioid users and the devastation of the spread of such did not likewise engage my community in the epidemic of crack and then cocaine. And they were victims of mandatory minimums, and it served no purpose, and it created mass incarceration. So I can't sit here and not put on the record what I'm willing to do, which is to have it on the list, Schedule I. But I want to see what the government intends to do and how, and I know there's a second panel, I hope to be able to hear from them, but how we intend to raise the ante of treatment and promoting treatment. So I'll start with you, Admiral, and then to Ms. Liscam. How will you frame your prosecution? Because Schedule I puts it clearly in the DOJ's wheelhouse, but getting the poor guy or girl down on the street taking this deadly, devastating drug, and not trying to respond to the larger marketers and sellers. I want to see what legislative tool you think you need. Obviously, we know what happens with Schedule I drugs, DA, all are involved. And how will you focus your efforts in trying to weed this out? So first, Admiral.
So thank you, ma'am. And it's good to see you again.
It's good to see you.
I've used this analogy before, but I think it works. If I can ask anyone on the committee to hold their breath for 10 minutes and not breathe, I can ask a person with a chronic brain disease of addiction, of opioid use disorder, to just stop. You cannot do it. It's a chronic brain disease that requires treatment, and that's why everything we've been doing at HHS is focused on treatment, of course prevention, but on treatment. And that treatment requires medications in almost all circumstances, and we work very closely with the DEA and DOJ to be able to do that. Psychosocial support, and it requires wraparound services, right? If a person is on the street, has food insecurity, does not have employment, does not have education, does not have a faith-based home, they're going to go right back to where they were, because we have to fix those parts of it too. So I couldn't agree with you more. I'll just make a couple of, just a brief comment, is that thanks to the work of Congress and working with the administration, the billions of dollars that have gone on the streets to support states have been used very well to provide naloxone, to provide therapy. What we're trying to enter into now in sort of one of our themes is more sustainable, resilient solutions. And we need to keep supporting, for example, the expansion of the behavioral health workforce that can take care of people with chronic behavioral disorders like addiction, both in our inner cities as well as in our rural areas. And we have to work on ways to make this long-lasting, because this is not going away tomorrow. And I would just highlight that we all are very afraid of and working diligently against the next wave, which are methamphetamines. Now methamphetamines are being combined with fentanyl and fentanyl analogues, which is really a even more poisonous cocktail. So the next wave is upon us, and we need to keep our efforts going.
Can you, that she has a second just to answer DOJ? Yes.
Yeah, so I just wanted to make a couple points. First, I take your comments very seriously and just want to assure you that the department is not targeting drug addicts. We need this tool of permanent class-wide scheduling in order to go after the cartels, the transnational criminal organizations who are trying to flood our streets in order to make enormous profits.
Thank you.
And I would just also point out that this order has been in effect for almost 2 years now, since February 6th of 2018, and we have not seen the overcriminalization that many critics have pointed to as a concern for the permanent class-wide scheduling. And lastly, I would just point out that the department is very much committed to its outreach efforts as a part of a sort of whole-of-government approach to solving this crisis. And we have been working, as I mentioned before, hand-in-hand with HHS on a number of initiatives. And every district throughout the country has an opioid coordinator, and part of their mission is to not only focus the prosecution efforts, but also the outreach efforts,
Thank you.
depending on what that district looks like. Thank you.
Mr. Klein.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate you holding this timely hearing on this issue. I'd ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter from the Federal Law Enforcement Officers Association, the National Sheriff's Association, urging passage of S3201, the temporary reauthorization and study of the Emergency Scheduling of Fentanyl Analogues Act.
Yes, thank you. I'll give you these back. Are they in this bag?
Madam Chair, I want to thank the witnesses for being here as well. And the opioid crisis has ravaged our nation and has touched the lives of thousands of American families who have lost loved ones to this terrible plight. Since 2013, fatal drug overdoses have been the leading cause of unnatural death in my home state of Virginia. In 2018, 54% of the fatal drug overdoses in Virginia were caused by fentanyl. In total, there were over 800 fatal fentanyl-related drug overdoses, and over 300 were from fentanyl analogues. Later today, this committee will hear firsthand from Mr. Donald Holman, whose family previously lived in Lynchburg in the 6th Congressional District of Virginia and has been forever impacted by the opioid crisis. Tragically, Mr. Holman lost his son Garrett in 2017 after he took a synthetic opioid delivered through the mail. The courage the Holman family has shown to tirelessly advocate to keep these dangerous drugs off our streets is inspiring. Mr. Holman's story and Garrett's story offers members of Congress and others a window into the opioid crisis, which has taken a heavy toll on our local communities. Just a few short days, the DEA's emergency scheduling will end, and communities already battling opioid addiction will face a wave of deadly drugs flooding our cities and towns if Congress does not act swiftly. And yes, the issue of mandatory minimums is one that we should debate, but in the meantime, people are dying, and we can take action to prevent these tragedies from occurring. I hope my colleagues here in Congress will come together to ensure that dangerous fentanyl analogs You stated that the quantity of analogs seen in law enforcement actions has decreased since the class scheduling was enacted 2 years ago. Are we seeing fewer fentanyl analogs at land border seizures as well?
I can't speak to the border seizures as the Department of Homeland Security through Customs and Border Patrol controls that area, but I do know that my understanding is at least that the data that DEA is reporting with respect to a 50% decrease are for fentanyl analogs that are coming in through any manner. And we have definitely seen, I don't have the statistic, but we have definitely seen a large decrease in the amount of fentanyl and fentanyl analogs coming through the mail from China. So again, this is a testament to the fact that this scheduling order is working.
And how has the current temporary scheduling order helped DOJ in their efforts to pursue and prosecute individuals for drug trafficking? In particular, if you could focus on the process by which they are sent through the mail.
Sure. So I think the biggest distinction is that DOJ prosecutors are able to prosecute these crimes under Title 21 United States Code 841 as opposed to using the Analog Act. Under the Analog Act, which is incredibly resource and time consuming, the department is required to prove that the substances are intended for human consumption, that they are chemically similar to the underlying substance, such as fentanyl in this case, and that they have the same, I'm summarizing here, but the same psychostimulant effect. That requires experts on both sides. Many of those experts are actually DEA chemists who are being taken away from labs and actually testing the drugs. The prosecutors have to get savvy on all of this type of lingo. They have to educate the jury, the judge, and then they have to sort of walk the jury through and get them to a point where they can find this individual guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. It is a huge resource drain, and being able to prosecute under Title 21, 841, and 846 allows us to go after these transnational criminal organizations and use our resources correctly.
Good. And what would be the impact on communities already battling the opioid epidemic if Congress doesn't extend the scheduling of fentanyl-related substances?
So again, I think we can point to what we've seen over the past 2 years, a 50% decrease in the amount of fentanyl analogs coming in, and that is what the communities are seeing on the street, a 50% decrease in these substances that are killing Americans.
Thank you. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Ms. McBeth?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you both so much for being here today and being here to discuss this serious public health crisis that we have before us. And I want to thank the many researchers at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, which is part of my district, and basically near my district. Their research is critical to making sure that we are making informed decisions that will keep our communities and our loved ones safe. Admiral, in your testimony, and I've actually had a chance to read a bit of your testimony, you discussed several recommendations that are a part of what you described as an interagency solution that balances the need to restrict access to these substances with the need for continued research. Are there any policies that you feel are especially important so that we can continue to get a better understanding and a better sense of this life-threatening problem without overburdening our researchers?
Yes, ma'am, thank you. And thank you for reading the testimony. We outlined about 8 steps that we agreed to. And again, I want to say this was truly interagency. We had members of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, multiple centers at the National Institutes of Health, the FDA, as well as representatives of myself, along with Mr. Dillon, the administrator of the DEA, the Deputy Attorney General, Jim Carroll, that we all worked on this together, because we do recognize there's a balance that we need to achieve both goals. We need to get analogs and keep them off the street and keep them scheduled, but we do need to make both these and other Schedule I substances more available to CDC, NIH, even FDA, in order to approve drugs. So we outlined those 8 simple steps that might not be all-inclusive, and one of those steps was that the Attorney General and the Secretary of HHS would put a task force together to really look at this comprehensively to see if there were further things we can do. But clearly the first 7, as we saw in the testimony, I don't want to waste your time, but would be really, really important, and everybody around the room agreed.
Well, thank you for that. And also, can you elaborate on how HHS considers the impact of special populations, such as children or people that have particular illnesses, and how do we make sure that we're keeping kids safe from these dangerous drugs while also making sure that researchers are fully able and capable to seek out new treatments?
Yes, ma'am. Special populations are a particular interest. I'm a pediatric intensive care physician by training, and so taking care of children from newborns to 15 or 16-year-olds are what I do and what my passion is for. So we're very particularly, let me say that we're investing an enormous amount of resources, for example, in children who are born dependent on opioids because their mothers were using opioids. And we approach this as a treatment, right? We have to keep the mother and child together. We want them both to recover. The NIH is investing literally $50, $60 million into their program for that. I'm personally very concerned. One of our big initiatives is also need it. For example, patients with cancer, or I'm a particular advocate for children and adults with sickle cell disease. And in our reports, for example, our pain management task force, there's a whole section on treatment of special populations like people with sickle cell disease, or like people with cancer or with other chronic illnesses, because we don't want to devastate people who are in real pain when they really need the drugs while we're achieving this. So there are a number of special populations, and be happy to go through them with you to make sure we get all of them, because we want to treat everyone, not just the average person, but everyone and their particular needs. We want to meet them where they are.
Thank you for that answer. And Ms. Liskman, we all want to keep these dangerous substances away from our communities, and especially away from our children. And some have recommended tough criminal penalties that actually do that. We also want to make sure that if these drugs do reach our communities, the emergency responders and medical professionals are able to intervene to prevent these tragedies. How can we make sure that these goals don't conflict?
I don't believe that they do conflict. The department is very much committed to outreach efforts targeting children to make sure that they are not getting involved in experimenting with opioids and getting addicted to them. One of the districts has a opioid youth summit where they send a youth ambassador from each high school to learn from victim family members, law enforcement, public health officials about the dangers of opioid use, and then brings that back to their high schools to tell everyone about that, what they've learned. That is an incredibly important part of what the department is doing, but is sort of separate and apart from the tools that we need to go after these transnational criminal organizations that are flooding our communities with this incredibly lethal poison. And so I think that we can sort of accomplish both of those through the department's efforts.
Thank you.
With your permission, I just want to highlight Drug Take-Back Day is very important. Many children get first exposed to opioids by leftover drugs in the cabinet. And this has been a tremendous national success. About 1 million pounds of pills are turned in for destruction multiple times per year. So getting rid of those excess drugs so they don't fall into the hands of your children or your relatives is still a very important thing that we do.
Mr. Gomer?
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I appreciate having this hearing. Glad we're having it before the expiration of the laws that restrict fentanyl and its analogs. I guess we could have had it last year, but time was of the essence. The president was a clear and present danger. That was before the month we didn't take up impeachment after it was passed in the House. But eventually we got around to this hearing. And obviously it's important, as the Holmans know, having lost a son. We're talking about something that is extremely addictive. And I'm glad, Admiral Gerard, to hear you say you're in favor of continuing the listing, because I had concerns from your written testimony that you might want to see that eased up so that it would be easier for researchers to get the fentanyl analogs. But clearly, that is something we need to work on so it's easier for researchers to get it. Fentanyl is used in some lawful medications, right? I mean, I tore my meniscus in the congressional baseball game, and when I had surgery, I said to as I was about to go under, what's in this anesthesia? And he named a couple of things and said fentanyl, and went, fentanyl? And that was the last thing I heard before I went out. But also, you'd mentioned the DEA. I'm surprised the majority did not want to hear from the DEA. They did not want to hear from the Office of National Drug Control Policy. But from my experience as a felony judge, nobody knows more about the illegal drug situation in America than the DEA. Would you all agree with that from the law enforcement standpoint?
I think that DEA is one of the preeminent experts on drug trafficking trends, both international and domestically.
Admiral, have you had that experience?
Yes, sir, and literally every week, if not multiple times a week, the interagency, including DEA, ONDCP, DOJ, myself, HUD, are all around the single table, so we're pretty highly coordinated.
Well, I have here a letter from the National President of the National Fraternal Order of Police, Patrick Yose, And he says he's writing on behalf of the members of the Fraternal Order of Police to advise you of our strong support for the swift consideration and passage of S-3201, that's the Senate bill, temporary reauthorization and study of emergency scheduling of Fentanyl Analogues Act, which the Senate passed by unanimous consent. The legislation would extend for 15 months classification of fentanyl as a Schedule I drug, classification which expires 6 February, next week. For this reason, the consideration and passage of this bill is a matter of some urgency, as drug overdose deaths are surging across the country, although we know that actually, since it's been listed, Ms. Liscombe, as you indicated, 17,000 contacts by our law enforcement have been reduced to 8,000. And you know that's got to mean fewer deaths as a result. And it seems to be, from what I've seen, if law enforcement is having half as much contact with a drug, that normally can be projected that there's probably half as much coming in as there was previously. Would you agree?
I would, sir.
Okay. Anyway, he just goes on to make the point that the police across the country, the national order, they all agree this needs to be listed. And like I say, Admiral, we want to make it easier for researchers to get it, use it, and find answers. But I understand the problem here has been some in the majority were very concerned about mandatory minimums. In Texas, we call that a range of punishment. There is a low level, and then there's the minimum and a maximum. And depending on the level of the crime, that determines the minimum and the maximum. And it's a good way to do things, as I found. And having sent someone to prison whose family hated my guts, they were extremely wealthy, but she had experimented with everything, and her mother says, "Thank you, you saved our daughter's life." It can help. We do need addiction centers to deal with some prisoners, and I hope we can work together on that. I yield back.
For the record, the committee did invite the DEA, and we were honored that they recommended Ms. Liskin to come.
Madam Chair, could I offer or ask unanimous consent to include
Without
the list?
objection. Ms. Jackson Lee wants to enter some articles.
Yes, thank you so very much, Madam Chair. Letter from nearly 70 organizations outlining their concern about extending the DEA quickly. Statement for the record submitted by the American Psychological Association. Letter from the American Society for Pharmacology and Experimental Therapy. Letter from Charles P. France, PhD, Robert, a professor, about concerns of this legislation. Letter from the Sentencing Project regarding today's hearing. Letter from the Drug Policy Alliance regarding today's hearing. January 2020 report from the Drug Policy Alliance titled Criminal Justice Reform in the Fentanyl Era. And finally, January 26, 2020, Washington Post op-ed by Nancy Gertner titled William Barr's New War on Drugs. I ask unanimous consent that each of
Without
these be
objection.
submitted to the record. Thank you.
Mr. Rushenthaler?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I too would ask for unanimous consent to enter a letter from the Addiction Policy Forum. Thank you. Thank you again, Chairwoman Bass, and thank you for our witnesses for being here today. I'm incredibly disappointed that my colleagues across the aisle are dragging their feet on legislation to combat the flow of fentanyl substances into our communities. This is an extremely lethal drug. It only takes 3 milligrams of fentanyl to kill an average-sized adult. By comparison, a fatal dose of heroin is 30 milligrams. The opioid crisis is an issue that hits every single congressional district, Republican or Democrat. It's a pandemic. We should not play partisan politics when it comes to people's lives. In 2017, my home state of Pennsylvania was ranked third in the United States for drug overdose deaths. And fentanyl was present in roughly 2/3 of those fatalities. Speaking bluntly, people are dying, and my Democrat colleagues are sitting on their hands. The House should have approved the Senate bill, which passed the other chamber working on this instead of wasting all our time on this sham impeachment. This is absolutely shameful. But thankfully, we have a president who is treating this crisis with the seriousness it deserves. In 2018, President Trump secured a commitment from China to address the flow of fentanyl into the United States. The following year, China permanently scheduled fentanyl, making fentanyl drugs illegal for manufacture, possession, and sale. President Trump's actions are working. If you look at the stats, in 2019, the amount of fentanyl and fentanyl analogues smuggled in from China decreased. So it's critical that the House follow the Senate's lead to pass legislation and extend the temporary scheduling of fentanyl-related substances before the February 6th deadline. American lives are at risk. Dr. Girwa, excuse me.
Yes, sir.
I have heard pushback from the other side that scheduling fentanyl hinders important medical research. Can you briefly outline steps that HHS has taken to provide researchers with access to study these substances?
So thank you for that. And I want to be absolutely clear that in an ideal world, we would like it permanently scheduled and the research protections to be at the same time, but we have to schedule these drugs, or else we're going to have thousands more deaths this year. The emergency rooms are not going to be able to detect it. Some of the harm reduction measures we have are not going to be effective. So we do support it being scheduled. The kinds of research protections we talked about, again, are the ability to rapidly deschedule or reduce the schedule of drugs. And again, this is not something just from HHS. This is something that the interagency has decided is very important because, look, they want reversal agents and better treatment as well as we do, as well as some activities that would, for example, if you're approved to do work on one substance, you have to go through the whole process if you want to go through another analog. And that just doesn't make, sort of common logical sense. So these kind of simplified procedures, we think, are very consistent with scheduling, but also achieving our goals. They're not mutually exclusive. We think we can do both.
Thank you, Doctor. I appreciate it. And I would yield the remainder of my time to my colleague from Arizona, Ms. Lesko.
Thank you. I have a question. Ms. Liscombe, can you repeat what you said about in order to get a 5-year minimum sentence, what has to happen? Because we heard, at least I heard, that Chairman Nadler, this was one of the reasons for the holdup because of the concern over this minimum mandatory sentencing.
So in order to trigger a 5-year mandatory minimum, there needs to be 5,000, the equivalent of 5,000 lethal doses of a fentanyl analog. In order to trigger a 10-year mandatory minimum, you need the equivalent of 50,000 lethal doses of a fentanyl analog.
And what does that mean? They have to be dealing it, possessing it? What does that mean?
So under the statute, it could be possession, possession with intent to distribute, manufacturing, distribution, importation, conspiracy of all of these different crimes as well. We need every tool that we can to go after these criminals.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd like to, thank the panelists, thank your witness for being here today, and I'd like to call forward the next panel. Dr. Comer, Mr. Butler, Mr. Holman, and Dr. Ciccarone. Okay. Before you sit down, thank you. I want to swear everyone in. We welcome our second set of risen, I want to begin by swearing you in. Raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you are about to give is true and correct to the best of your knowledge, information, and belief, so help you God? Let the record show the witnesses answered in the affirmative. Thank you, and please be seated. We'll now proceed with introductions, starting with the panel. Dr. Comer is professor of neurobiology in the Department of Psychiatry at the Columbia University and Research Science at the New York State Psychiatric Institute. She is also director of the Opioid Laboratory in the Division on Substance Use Disorders and runs a very active research program devoted to examining various aspects of the abuse liability of opioids. Mr. Butler is the federal public defender for the Northern District of Alabama. Prior to his appointment, Mr. Butler defender for the Middle District of Alabama. Mr. Holman is a father who lost his son Garrett to overdose from a synthetic opioid called U47700. Since his family's loss, he has been an advocate to help address the opioid crisis. He has attended roundtable meetings with Governor Christie and First Lady, as well as testified in Pennsylvania for Senator Jay Costa. Through his advocacy, he works to ensure other families do not lose loved ones to addiction. Dr. Ciccarone is a board-certified clinician in family medicine and addiction medicine. In his position as professor of family and community medicine at the University of California, San Francisco, he has been principal or co-investigator on numerous NIH-sponsored public health research projects, including his current heroin in transition study. He is also the associate on the triple wave crisis of opioids, heroin, and fentanyl in the United States. Dr. Comer, you can begin. Go ahead.
Chair, Ranking Member, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for holding today's hearing on class-wide scheduling of synthetic fentanyls. I'm Dr. Sandra Comer, Public Policy Officer of the College on Problems of Drug Dependence, a membership organization with over 1,000 members that has been in existence since 1929. CPDD is the longest-standing organization in the U.S. addressing problems of drug dependence and abuse. For over 2 decades, my research has focused on the development and testing of novel approaches to the treatment of opioid use disorder. The U.S. is experiencing an unprecedented increase in illicit use of opioids and its associated morbidity and mortality. In 2017, opioid overdoses claimed more than 47,000 lives in the U.S. Many of these deaths have been linked to illicitly manufactured fentanyl and its analogs. Fortunately, several medications are available and have been used successfully for treating opioid use disorder, including methadone, buprenorphine, and naltrexone. One concern with the introduction of fentanyl and its analogs to the street supply of illicit opioids is whether the approved treatment medications can effectively reduce use of these drugs. Further research on the ability of the approved as well as new medications for treating opioid use disorder in patients who are predominantly using fentanyl is clearly needed to address the fentanyl crisis. Naloxone is an antagonist that is used therapeutically to reverse opioid overdose. Recent reports suggest that higher or repeated dosing with naloxone may be required to reduce fentanyl-induced respiratory depression. It is not entirely clear. Additional studies are needed to assess the effectiveness of naloxone and other antagonists in reversing fentanyl-related overdoses. Fentanyl and its analogs are exceptionally potent, inexpensive, and easy to synthesize. Small modifications in these molecules can have profound effects on their activity, changing an inactive compound to an exceptionally potent opioid with high abuse potential. However, similarity in chemical structure does not necessarily translate to similarity in abuse liability. For example, oxymorphone is a potent mu-opioid receptor agonist with high abuse potential, while naltrexone and naloxone are opioid antagonists that have saved thousands of lives. All 3 medications share the same core chemical structure. This example illustrates how the antidote to a toxic substance and the toxic substance itself can share core structures. But the chemical structure of a compound alone cannot tell us whether it will have agonist or antagonist activity. Basic pharmacological studies must be performed in order to make this determination. Science-based agencies, specifically the Food and Drug Administration and the National Institute on Drug Abuse, should review the pharmacological activity, not just the chemical structures of these compounds. The committee should consider adding a role for HHS, subjecting compounds to limited tests of pharmacological activity through animal models using a rapid process that could be undertaken by NIDA and a designated pre-screened team of extramural scientists. The current fentanyl crisis poses a formidable challenge to Congress and the DEA, since there are literally thousands of fentanyl supports efforts to control the distribution, sales, and use of these synthetic fentanyls. However, to globally put all compounds that are chemically similar to fentanyl in Schedule I is likely to severely limit biomedical research and, in the long term, adversely impact public health. Obtaining a DEA Schedule I registration is complicated, burdensome, and can take a long time, sometimes more than a year, disincentivizing researchers in general, and particularly young researchers. To ensure more research on synthetic fentanyls, Congress should consider instituting, by legislation, procedures for streamlining the process for obtaining a Schedule I license. I can expand on these specific recommendations during the question and answer session following my testimony. Scientists have dedicated their careers to research to save lives. More information, not less, is the best way we can achieve that goal. I encourage you and your colleagues to consider alternative approaches so that the potential benefits and risks of new chemical entities can be characterized before decisions are rendered regarding DEA scheduling.
Mr. Butler?
Chairwoman Bass, Ranking Member Radcliffe, members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting my perspective as you consider how to best respond to the opioid epidemic. Before I begin, I'd like to pause and recognize Mr. Holman and your family. I am so sorry for your loss. This is a complex issue. I do not pretend to have all the answers, but DOJ's proposal will simply repeat what does not work. Policies that are trumpeted as targeting kingpins that instead severely punish low-end offenders and users. My testimony here today is based on my personal experience and on behalf of the National Association of Federal Defenders. What we fear is that history is repeating itself. I grew up in Toledo, Ohio, just south of Detroit. By the time I graduated high school in 1984, crack addiction and war on drug laws had devastated my community. Friends and relatives with little or no criminal history who are abusing crack and selling it to support their habit were going to prison to serve long mandatory sentences with no relief. Meanwhile, drug kingpins who had information prosecutors wanted could cooperate and earn reduced sentences. As a young public defender in 1992, I'll never forget the devastation on my client's face when I told him he was facing a mandatory minimum 10-year sentence. He was a young black man, my exact age. He had no criminal history and a severe crack addiction. He was arrested for crack found in the car he was driving. Year after year, my colleagues and I fought for sentence reductions, but it was more of the same. Young minorities charged with nonviolent drug offenses being sent to prison for long mandatory sentences. Over the past decade, I've been encouraged by laws moving away from these failed and destructive approaches. The Fair Sentencing Act of 2010 reduced the unjust crack cocaine disparity, and about a year ago, the First Step Act became law. Both passed with overwhelming bipartisan support, and both recognize that sentencing nonviolent drug dealers to oversized prison terms does not cure our problems. We must focus on education, treatment, and reducing overdose deaths. We have 30 years of evidence showing that a drug policy predicated on severe one-size-fits-all punishments does not work. Class-wide scheduling is not the solution. Fear and misinformation are being used to support the call for class-wide scheduling. Make no mistake, a class-wide ban will silence health experts and ignore science. I urge you to cast a critical eye on calls for this ban. Let me first address the misinformation. To be clear, harmful fentanyl analogs are illegal now, with or without class-wide scheduling. If the class-wide ban expires, no harmful fentanyl analog will become legal. I was glad to see Judge Nancy Gerstner's article this Sunday that has been entered into the record. This addresses that. The article addressed that. The government already, too, has powerful tools to ban and prosecute fentanyl and its analogs. The first tool is scheduling. With HHS, the Department of Justice can schedule any substance that meets certain criteria, and DOJ can use its broad authorities under the Controlled Substance Act to temporarily schedule and then prosecute through the HHS process. Many fentanyl analogs have already been scheduled this way. The second tool is the Analog Act. This allows DOJ to criminalize substances that are chemically similar and have similar biological effects compared to drugs that are already scheduled. DOJ has used these tools to wage aggressive and successful prosecutions. Between 2014 and 2018, the number of individuals sentenced for fentanyl-related offenses has increased by 4,711%. But who is DOJ prosecuting? In 2018, the GAO found that DOJ was, quote, targeting street-level and mid-level distributors rather than focusing more heavily on traditional targets such as cartels. Less than 6% of prosecutions involved and over 3/4 of the people were people of color. This is the war on drugs, part 2. Currently, if DOJ wants to schedule a substance quickly, it can. But before substances are permanently scheduled, the law requires health experts at HHS to confirm that the drug is actually harmful and check for any potential beneficial uses. The class-wide ban would remove this expertise from the process. We don't even know how many substances the ban would schedule, let alone their effects on the human body.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Holman?
Chairwoman Bass, Ranking Member Radcliffe, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify today. My name is Don Holman. My son Garrett's 21st birthday was on February 17th, 2017, but he never saw it. He died on February the 9th. He grew up in Lynchburg, Virginia, where he established friendships in grammar school that carried through high school. Growing up, he spent endless hours playing sports and spending time with family and friends. Garrett was diagnosed at an early age with ADHD and took medication to help him concentrate in school. But as Garrett grew older, he resisted taking the medication and started self-medicating with marijuana. As parents, we were not aware until he started having disciplinary issues at school. Our focus soon became to make sure he graduated from high school and hopefully go to college. We went through many different scenarios, from trying to set boundaries and rules to trying to get him treatment for anxiety and depression. We would make excuses for Garrett's behavior to friends, family, and coworkers, but never reveal the extent on which his illness had progressed. I never gave up hope, and I was proud of my son. He needed medication for anxiety, but due to his tendency to abuse, he was never diagnosed or treated properly. So sometime in November 2016, he ordered U47700 online, and it was delivered to the house by the U.S. Postal Service. Garrett overdosed the first time in December 2016, where I had to perform CPR until the paramedics arrived to administer naloxone and transport him to the hospital. Once he awakened in ICU, it was obvious that this was not the wake-up call he had hoped. So he was forced into a mental health evaluation. From there, he reluctantly went into a 30-day in-house treatment program, but a week after he got out, he overdosed the second time. I forced him into a second evaluation, but the judge decided he did not belong in a mental health facility and released him on February the 6th, 2017. His final overdose was 3 days later on February the 9th. You're never prepared to lose a child. Garrett's death has pulled our family apart, and we work to deal with our loss in a different way, each in a different way. believe he deserved to die for his initial bad choices. I understand that today's session is to hear testimony on extending the temporary class-wide scheduling on fentanyl analogs. By extending the ban, in my opinion, we continue to control what is coming into the U.S., killing Americans, and allow time to finalize the permanent solution that also allows for research access and ensures the punishment fits the crime. Garrett's struggles were not a death sentence until he discovered synthetic opioids. I have learned that before the temporary ban, analogs were a challenge to schedule until each slight variation was identified and scheduled individually. Class-wide scheduling allows for an urgent response to this fast-moving global crisis. Since that time, law enforcement has been able to aggressively bring high-tech criminal drug traffickers to justice, and China is now with the U.S. in similar scheduling for fentanyl analogs. If we back off, China and other countries may follow, and the result will be catastrophic because criminals are counting on as an opportunity to make a tremendous amount of money with absolutely no regard for human life. Without class-wide scheduling, they can produce, distribute, and kill with less risk of being held accountable. I am also sensitive to situations where mandatory minimums may need to be considered, but not today, not here, and not in relation to fentanyl. Today, someone using or selling fentanyl or one of the analogs for any reason is very likely to kill themselves or someone else. I went from fighting to keep my son out of jail to fighting to get him into jail to save his life. I failed both times. Instead, let's continue to focus on jail and prison reform so individuals are treated like human beings and the goal is rehabilitation and a permanent return to society. My friend Sheriff Kochi in Hampden County, Massachusetts has this type of rehabilitation program in place. He even allows adult males not charged with a crime into his facility for treatment. If my son would have gone to jail for an extended period of time, I would at least be able to visit him. If he was receiving treatment for mental health and substance abuse issues, I feel sure he would be here today. Because of the bipartisan support in fighting the opioid crisis, politics do not play a role in the decision to approve the extension. Additionally, I have also not read any scientific studies that indicate a person's gender, race, religion, or political affiliation makes them exempt from the tragic effects of the opioid crisis. In conclusion, I ask that you please extend class-wide scheduling as soon as possible, but also let's continue to work towards a permanent solution that will continue to give law enforcement an effective tool while also minimizing any concerns. Please allow the opioid crisis to be the issue that encourages everyone to reach across the aisle and put Americans and American lives first. I would also like to thank this committee, Congress, the White House, ONDCP, HHS, CBP, HSI, DOJ, and DEA for everything you do to combat the opioid crisis. Each step forward is a step closer to resolving this issue, which will not only save thousands of American lives, but will also ensure
Dr. Ciccarone?
Mr. Holman, my condolences for your loss. It's good to see you again today. Thank you, Dan. Chair Bass, Ranking Member Ratcliffe, and other distinguished members of this subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to speak in front of you today. My name is Dan Ciccarone. I am a professor of family and community medicine at UCSF, and I am an addiction medicine specialist, an academic researcher, and drug policy expert. I know the current overdose crisis firsthand. I have witnessed it at the ground level in my research, and my team and I have published extensively on it. Here are my thoughts on how the Class 1 schedule in fentanyl derivatives might work counter to the goals of public health. One, the class of fentanyls has a large number of unexplored compounds, over 1,400, some of which have been identified already as partial agonists and antagonists at the opioid mu receptor. Because of the potency of illicit fentanyl, it is important to explore new antagonists to reverse overdose and new treatments to address greater dependency, and these may come from the fentanyl class. Based on my research, users and low-level dealers typically do not know if the drug they are selling or using contains fentanyl. Making the class ban on fentanyl permanent will likely increase trends in fentanyl trafficking and prosecution, which disproportionately affect those at the bottom of the supply chain. Point 3, Class 1 scheduling has not been shown effective in reducing the number of overdose deaths, nor reduce fentanyl availability. The latest provisional data from the CDC as of June 2019 shows synthetic opioid overdoses continuing to rise at a rate of 8.3% over the year prior. This is in spite of 15 months of emergency scheduling. In an analysis of 10 years of drug seizure data from Ohio, which my team and I have just published this month, we found a steady rate of novel synthetics, of novel fentanyls being introduced through the end of 2018. Now, I know That only includes 10 months of emergency scheduling, so we need more data on that. However, I do want to point out a drug policy metaphor, and that is that squeezing the drug supply balloon often causes supply to pop out in unexpected places. We're already seeing the U series, the AH series, the other series of non-fentanyl synthetics coming out. We do not know what happens next. Point 4, despite decades of strong prohibitionist efforts, drug mortality is increasing exponentially. A report in the journal Science found that exponential growth in overdose deaths from 1978 to 2016. This exponential increase in drug overdose deaths was not defined by any specific class of drugs. The triple wave fentanyl opioid crisis is just the last phase of this 38-year phenomenon. The reasons for this worst case public health scenario involves two failures. First, that of drug prohibition to stop the drug supply balloon from morphine. And secondly, the failure to address the underlying or root causes of problematic drug use. There is growing evidence that we need to address the social economic determinants of health, the root causes of drug demand, and the overdose crisis, if we are to fill in the cracks of society that the waves of drug supply fall into. Overdose deaths due to illicit fentanyl represent a historic crisis, one full of challenges. But this era is also one of historic opportunity to rebalance our drug policies more in favor of demand reduction, including treatment, and away from failed prohibitionist policies, and to reorient to a healthier society resilient to problematic drug use. Specifically, we need to offer treatment over punishment. We need to expand treatment, reduce the barriers to buprenorphine, for example, with the Mainstreaming Addiction Treatment Act of 2019, which has House and Senate versions. We need greater support for prevention. Harm reduction's goal is to reduce deaths and other harms from drug use. Because it is person-centric, it can reduce stigma and engage folks where they're at. It can even serve as a bridge to treatment. One could argue that HIV/AIDS was a similar crisis in the 1990s. One with stigma and a head-in-the-sand approach at first, but one which was eventually addressed with comprehensive plan of prevention and treatment. Likewise now, we need a grand piece of legislation, like the Ryan White Care Act, to address the current crisis. In my small way, I've helped envision and promote such a comprehensive and balanced plan, including treatment, harm reduction, demand reduction, and supply reduction. Its implementation could signal the end of this unfortunate era. I thank you all for your time and we're willing to answer any questions you have.
Thank you. We'll now proceed under the 5-minute rule with questions. I will begin by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. In a minute, Mr. Butler, I'm going to ask you to finish what you were trying to say because I did interrupt you. So if there's other parts of your testimony that you wanted to give. But before I do that, I just wanted to know if you would comment. In the first panel, I asked the question about where this manufacturing of the analogs take place, and it was acknowledged it's in China and Mexico. And I don't understand why we can't get China and Mexico to stop. We slap tariffs on China, we threaten Mexico around the border, but yet we can't get that to happen. And I want to know your opinion about that. In other words, what can we do on the international side to stop the drugs from coming in? In addition to trying to stop it from crossing the border, I'm talking about stopping it from being manufactured. Turn your microphone on.
Chairwoman Bass, that's a wonderful question. I'll be frank with you, it's above my level. By that I mean I am the defender over a wonderful organization. We deal with what I will say the street level impact of these drugs. As far as what needs to be done at a national level addressing and stopping the drugs from coming over the border, I can't answer that. But what I can say is this. What we are not seeing on a national level is the prosecution of the importers, the major traffickers. What we are seeing, like my office and others throughout the country, is the prosecution of 4,000, 5,000 % increase in prosecution of low-level and mid-level dealers. I think DEA, Attorney General Barr, in their statements regarding this crisis has indicated that they need this scheduling order to become permanent so that they can go after the higher level people bringing it in from China, bringing it in from Mexico. Well, as to date, we're not seeing those prosecutions. What we are seeing is what we saw back in the 80s and 90s, the lower level people getting mandatory sentences and being prosecuted under this offense.
It's one thing to talk about the importation, but I'm talking about the manufacturing. So
Understood.
that you're not even did that. I don't understand why on a government level, and it just doesn't seem as though we are forcing the Chinese or the Mexican government to actually crack down on the manufacturing of it before it's even brought in. Mr. Holman, and then I'll go back to you, Mr. Butler. Did your son and did your family have access to drug treatment? Was it inpatient, outpatient?
In our situation, it wasn't primarily the substance abuse issue. It was a variety of items. Use of that was a 2-month period of time. It was so quick. He was not looking for something and found it. In essence, it was marketed to him. I brought his phone. This is the drug dealer that sold it to him. He was told that he can go online and order this from a regular website, use Bitcoins. This is a photograph of what was delivered to the house. It's an envelope that was addressed from China and the material that was in there. Once this was brought to his awareness, it was more of a situation, it was so fast. You didn't, the struggles we had before were seemingly manageable. But with this substance, it just took it to, it totally derailed everything.
Thank you. Mr. Butler, would you like to finish the testimony you were giving?
Yes, thank you. The last part of my testimony was the Trump administration estimates that the number of banned substances have ranged from hundreds to thousands to an infinite number. Even the administration concedes that fentanyl-related substances can range from deadly to beneficial to benign. I've already spoken to this, but I'll just repeat it. This will not work. We know that a punitive war on fentanyl will devastate communities and fuel mass incarceration. We're seeing that trend already. Let's keep evidence and health experts in the room, and together we'll find a better way. Thank you. That was my last portion.
Thank you. Dr. Comer, you recommended that in any scheduling of synthetic fentanyls, HHS and particularly its science-based agencies should be integrated into the process of reviewing the abuse liability of the suspect compounds. Can you talk about how that could be accomplished?
Yes, so as we heard earlier today, the HHS is involved with, scheduling decisions. What I was referring to was a streamlined process for making it easier to evaluate the pharmacology of these compounds without going through the full 8-factor analysis. And in fact, NIDA has a procedure in place for doing that. They've screened compounds rapidly for several decades, actually.
Thank you. Mr. Gomer?
Thank you, Chair. Appreciate y'all being here. We had heard testimony from the prior witnesses about how many lethal doses could end up or were required to send somebody to prison for the minimum. Mr. Butler, do you have a recommendation on how many lethal doses of fentanyl should trigger a prison sentence?
Well, exactly, wonderful question. If your question is exactly how much fentanyl should someone have before they go to jail, that's not my place. That's, I believe, the legislator's place. What I can say is that there were misrepresentations, I believe, by Ms. Lipscomb, not regarding the actual doses, but how drugs are actually used in real world. By that I mean the circumstance that Mr. Holcomb dealt with, that is coming into the mail and his son unfortunately and tragically using it, is not the circumstance that my office and other offices are seeing. What we're seeing is an individual on the street who doesn't know that he has fentanyl, has a mixture of substance about the size of an aspirin pill that he believes to be heroin.
My time is very limited, so let me move on. Mr. Holman, I understand how difficult it must be that we're told you can't truly sympathize with somebody unless you've been in their shoes. I do think there's something genetically in us that causes some people to be much more, have a much more addictive personality, and that's something I would love to see more research on. And but I can't help but wonder how you would feel about what Texas did back in the 90s when I was on the bench. Some people disagreed with it, but they were locked down felony punishment, substance abuse felony punishment facilities. Back then, I'd seen something indicating 70% of those who went to prison had a drug or alcohol addiction, and it seemed to make sense to me that we ought to have facilities where if you're addicted to something, that's where you go, and everything is about furthering your education and dealing with your addiction. Is that something that you contemplated might have been more help for your son?
Yes, those that are struggling are not maybe typical of what you would think. I mean, my son was bright, smart, intelligent. He could sit here and talk to you just as I am today. So sometimes they need to have that cloud lifted in some way so they can actually think clear to get the treatment they need. So in my case, that was not an option. You cannot force an adult into a treatment facility. I grew up in the 80s and 90s. I'm very familiar. I have personal experience with how maybe things were not handled correctly then. I talk about jail and prison reform, and the Sheriff Coachee I mentioned, I actually visited his facility and spent 5 hours. And I would recommend anyone look into what he's doing because of a law in the books. He takes people, all of his inmates are treated for substance abuse. They receive MAT, and even people who are not arrested go in, and it's not a bad thing.
Is that a 12-step program, or what is it?
It's a full program. You can't sum it up in a few minutes. You have to go look at his facilities and so forth. Mm-hmm. But I honestly feel like that this time where we're at, you have to pull people away with the crack cocaine. Just like with other substances, you may have a little bit more time. With the synthetic opioids, and especially fentanyl, it's not just pure fentanyl. It's put in a Xanax bar. It's mixed in with
put in
marijuana.
all kinds of things.
So what used to be the low-level dealer then is actually a drug trafficker now. So there's a lot. You people are 95% there. You're getting close. You're talking about all the right things because it's a complex process. My only ask is that don't let this expire. Extend, but then let's keep working. I'm local. I'll come whatever you need to satisfy mandatory minimums, to satisfy research opportunities so that everybody wins.
Well, my time is about to expire.
Sorry.
But let me just indicate that we've been hearing through the impeachment proceedings that it's totally inappropriate for a president to ask a foreign country to help us with some type of criminality that involves our country. But it sure sounds like that's something we ought to be doing with China. To root this out.
And I think I'm very close with those at ONDCP and they are working. China is working with us. The indications are with their scheduling, if we do not extend, they will be ahead of us with their scheduling. And Chairwoman Bass, that is something that I believe does help hold those countries accountable, not just China, but any other country that's poised to jump in and do the same thing. Because these are smart people. We don't talk enough about the criminals because it's not a good topic. But there are people out there that are high-tech, they're chemists, they're technologically capable to market this to our children and right under our noses.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Absolutely, and I would agree it's very important to hold foreign governments responsible when they are impacting the American people. Ms. McBath.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to each of you for being here today and just really shedding light on this really very deadly epidemic that we're dealing with. And Mr. Holman, I want to thank you so much for your testimony today. I offer you my deepest condolences because I understand what it's like to lose your child. I lost my child to an epidemic, but it was an epidemic of gun violence. So thank you so very much for willing to lend your voice and give great credibility to the ills of what we have to be able to challenge and to save our families. And Dr. Comer, thank you for being here to speak with us today about the needs of our nation's researchers as they work to make our communities safer and healthier. Your testimony explains the success that we've had saving lives with naloxone, also known as Narcan. But you mentioned that it doesn't always work well for fentanyl doses, and we may need to develop a related drug. So how can we facilitate that life-saving research while also carefully controlling access?
I think that's the rub here. You know, I understand the sentiment about wanting to put, you know, class-wide scheduling of fentanyl analogues into Schedule 1. The worry that I have really is that that's where the gap is, especially with regard to antagonists. By definition, they have no agonist activity. They, you know, so they would not likely rise to the occasion of being identified on the street. And the best way that they can be identified is by a chemist doing what is called structure-activity relationships. So a chemist and a pharmacologist kind of work together. So the chemist takes the core structure, develops a whole series of compounds, and as I said in my testimony, you can't tell just based on the chemical structure whether it will be an antidote or the toxic substance. So the chemist develops a series of compounds, passes it on to the pharmacologist, who runs these very rapid tests of whether or not it can be the antidote or whether it's really toxic. And so those experiments, you know, together will help us determine, you know, whether or not something is beneficial medically. And these types of tests that I'm talking about, I know that the concern of the DEA is, you know, this 8-factor analysis that takes a really long time to run. But these pharmacology experiments that I'm describing can be done rapidly. I mean, I did them when I was in graduate school. You can run a basic assay in a week to determine whether something is an agonist or an antagonist.
Okay,
So that's what I'm suggesting.
Thank you so much. I yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Klein?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank the witnesses for being here, for sharing their testimony. Mr. Holman, thank you for being here. I want to start with you. Is there anything else you'd like to add today, given the testimony that was given?
I think the only thing we'd say, we touch on treatment, we touch on prevention. It's prevention, enforcement, treatment, recovery. It's a Rubik's Cube. We can't get one side correct and ignore the others. My only ask is, don't let this expire so that we can continue to do what we're doing, but let's not give up and let's not ignore the concerns, and let's address those for a permanent solution going forward. And let's not stand back again. Let's look forward. Let's get in front of this and stop chasing it. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Ciccarone, in your testimony, you state the class of fentanyls has a large number of unexplored compounds, some of which are theoretically beneficial for treatment or as overdose antagonists. And Schedule 1 classification would inhibit basic science and clinical research. So I'd ask, once a substance is placed in Schedule 1, does it mean researchers can't access it, or does it just mean the process for doing so takes more time?
It simply takes more time. I was unaware of the interagency agreement that Dr. Admiral Girard mentioned today, that there's a way to sort of deschedule some of these things. I do share Dr. Comer's concern, though, and that is the discovery phase will have a wet blanket thrown on it.
If a researcher has all the necessary permissions to access Schedule 1 drugs, that what you're saying is then they don't need to apply for different permissions to access the fentanyl analogs that are temporarily scheduled, right?
That I don't know.
Okay.
Maybe Dr. Comer might know that.
Share any information on that?
I mean, the way the procedure works now, you do have to. You apply for a Schedule 1 license, and it's compound by compound. So I think, you know, some of the suggestions that have been made about, you know, providing research exemptions and streamlining the process are really good ones. The biggest worry, as I mentioned, that I have is that an antagonist, which has no pharmacological activity other than blocking the receptor, and so naloxone is an example of that. People don't get high off of it. but it's the antidote. And you know, the worry is that naloxone, in many cases of fentanyl or carfentanil-related overdoses, it just doesn't work. I mean, I've heard, you know, from EMTs who say that they've given 5, 6 doses of naloxone, and the person still dies. So, you know, we need to find other kinds of antagonist solutions, and often, so it kind of makes sense that the chemical structure of a compound that's an antagonist would be very similar to the agonist. So, you know, the receptor has a certain conformation, and then the agonist binds there, and it has a certain shape that fits into that conformation. So, and then it activates the receptor. The antagonist is one that fits into that receptor, but it doesn't activate it because you add something to it. So, you know, so that's my big worry here, is that with the synthetic, you know, putting everything into Schedule I will make it really difficult for us to find those kinds of antidotes.
Thank you. I yield back.
Ms. Jackson-Lee?
Thank you so very much, Madam Chair. Let me thank both of you for holding this hearing again, and the Judiciary Committee and full committee members. This is something that I've worked on for a long time. I remember when we were discussing fentanyl and nobody knew what it was, and it's now an epidemic. Mr. Holman, may I offer my deepest sympathy? A child is so precious, and I have seen families bury children all over the nation. So I wanted to just make a point that we need to look globally, because there's 2 points that you made that I want to pick up with legislation, and I want to ask Mr. Butler as well. One, how frustrating it is that you wanted to get your son help, and the only option was a jail, except you used the example of a sheriff who was creative instead of giving treatment. A powerful country like us. So that, number one. Number two, your son first was exposed to it online from China. And so if I think I was reading the notes correctly. And so we have a layered issue that we have to deal with. But could you just briefly talk about this whole thing of parents being frustrated by the fact that the only option you had was a jail, but then he couldn't stay in the jail or they wouldn't keep him?
Yes, ma'am, thank you. It doesn't start with that either. And there's parents today, it's amazing. You will talk to your Uber driver this afternoon, talk to somebody and mention naloxone, mention fentanyl, and they have no idea, and we're right here. You know, we all start out with our kids, we want the best for them, you know, and you taper down, they start getting in trouble. Each person has a different path, but when you do get to the point where you need help, you have to go through a process. And first, jail, you're right, we don't want them to go to jail because there's so much. My opinion is on the mandatory minimum, how long they go to jail. Yes, I didn't want my son to go to jail at all in the beginning. Didn't want him to be in there. My biggest concern, though, is what he was taking away from that. I have people that I've talked to since then, amazing, productive, great people that have had a situation. They've gone to jail for longer than they should, but it helped them. They're productive today. But they have felony charges, nonviolent felony charges.
So what might I just say, I don't want to interrupt you, might it be better if it was a treatment facility that your son could go to, that he would stay in and not be released to help him? That's what I was saying.
Yes.
That your option was a jail. Let me be on the record, I'm against mandatory minimums because your son could get caught up with it, as well as others can get caught up in it. But you need a system that allows, or families, first of all, we need to end this epidemic, but while it's here, we need a system that protects your child, would have protected your child with treatment. Is that yes or no?
Yes, it is.
Okay, and let me thank you and say to you that I'm committed.
Can I add one thing to that?
Yes, you may.
The example I gave was where someone is held in a correctional facility and treated but not charged. Now, that's unique, but if you're 18 or over, you can walk out of any facility unless you're held in.
But treatment would be, I understand, might be a little different in terms of its framework. Even though, you know, I understand what you're saying. You're saying that if you're an adult, they can't hold you against your will. We've dealt with that. That's a real serious issue, and that's something that we have to look at state level and otherwise. But my sympathy again, and thank you for bringing your insight to this.
Thank you.
My own self. Let me try to get 2 more questions. Let me first of all say that I'm I'm inspired by this Ryan White concept, Dr. Cicerone, And we're going to immediately turn to that and see how we can fit it into this epidemic now. But let me ask the two of you, Mr. Butler, to clarify your earlier testimony of how many grains of a substance with a detectable amount of fentanyl trigger a mandatory minimum. But I also want you to, when I asked the question of DOJ, and they said, oh, no, we don't prosecute drug addicts, but you've now enlightened it. It's these low-level people that also are victims of sorts. I'd like you to comment on that, and I'd like the professor to comment on framing this new, and I only have a couple of seconds, so framing this response like the Ryan White Treatment Act. Mr. Butler, just quickly on that point.
Yes, I'll try to answer all questions.
Yeah, just answer the one about the triggering and the low level.
In front of Mr. Holman right now is a paper clip. That paper clip weighs approximately 10 grams. If an individual possesses that much in fentanyl combined with something else, an inert substance in order to be mixed with it, that person is looking at a mandatory 5 years in jail. If that person has something the size of 10 paper clips, he's looking at a mandatory 10 years in jail.
Can I pause you for a moment? I know that some others will let you answer. Doctor, you got about 2 seconds to say.
I'll just say that current federal legislation has helped, but it's a drop in the bucket. Overdoses have gone down about 5%. We need a lot more if we want to tackle this crisis.
Thank you. I'm so sorry, but I got your answer. Thank you so very much. I yield back. Thank you.
Cicilline?
Thank you, Madam Chair, for holding this really important hearing. I think, first of all, thank you all for being here. Mr. Holman, we all extend to you our deepest sympathies for the loss of your child, and sadly, we have had in all of our communities the same kind of loss. In my state, 233 Rhode Islanders last year lost their lives to opioid overdoses. So we want to get this right. We're living with the consequences of this addiction epidemic, which is ravaging our country. But I want to kind of understand how we've gotten to this place with respect to at least the legal framework. And so, Professor Comer, the DEA's emergency authorization authority expires on February 6, 2020, and the DEA is ineligible for a one-year extension to this timeline because it has not asked HHS or the FDA to determine if their scheduling action is medically and scientifically valid. Is that correct? And if so, why? Do you know why they have not made that request?
So I think it has to do more with the blanket-wide scheduling issue. So normally the HHS does its 8-factor analysis on a single compound, which is reasonable and makes sense. You can't do that with a potentially infinite number of analogs. So there's nothing really that the FDA could evaluate as a single compound.
Okay.
That's where the problem comes.
Okay. Now, we've heard the argument that if this classification or this extension is not granted, that the government will not be able to prosecute effectively fentanyl. Of course, there is the Analog Act, which provides for up to 20 years in prison for a first offense, up to 30 years in prison for a second offense, and a mandatory minimum of death resulting. So, Mr. Butler, is this notion, are there tools in place if this expires that would continue to allow the government to successfully prosecute fentanyl cases?
Yes. And fentanyl prosecutions under the Analog Act are up approximately 5,000%.
So this notion of if we don't do this somehow, the Attorney General has made the argument that somehow fentanyl has become legal is not true.
Yes.
Okay. Yes, it is not true.
Yeah, yes, it is not true.
I just want to understand because I think this is important and we have to actually get this record correct. And if in fact there is any danger that an extension of this will make the problem worse and make more victims of this public health crisis, then that's not a good idea. And so I want to be sure that the criminal prosecution framework is robust and remains in place regardless, and you say it is. Professor Comer, what I'm also interested in is nearly $6.8 million in new federal grants will enable researchers to collaborate with state agencies to investigate innovative public health approaches to address the opioid crisis. For instance, researchers in my district at Brown University are working to find ways to reduce overdoses and provide evidence-based public health solutions to the opioid crisis. Is there any risk that class-wide scheduling may undermine evidence-based approaches to addressing this opioid crisis? And if so, can you elaborate on how class-wide scheduling poses a risk to finding public health solutions to this deadly crisis? Because that's the goal here, and what we don't want to do is, in an effort to respond to this request, actually make a very deadly problem more deadly.
So I'm familiar with the research that's coming out of your state, and it's excellent. And they've done a really great job of trying to move the field forward in terms of addressing this issue. The concern that I have, and thankfully, things like Narcan, naloxone are available for reversing overdose. The problem, as I stated, is that it doesn't work in all cases, and we don't know why. And so the continued development of additional types of antagonists is really critical to getting a complete handle on this problem. And so the impact on research is really more at the basic science level, the level of the chemists, the level of the pharmacologists who are searching for these kinds of antagonists that will be more effective than naloxone. So that's where I think the greatest harm would occur.
Thank you very much. Madam Chair, I would ask that unanimous consent that this article, which appeared in the Providence Journal, which describes a comparison between the state of Rhode Island and Portugal on its public health response to the opioid crisis, be made a part of the record.
Without objection.
And I yield back.
Ms. Mercurso-Paul?
Thank you, Ms. Bass. You come into these hearings and you have all the questions that you want to ask the witnesses, and then I hear testimony and my head is spinning trying to ask specific questions to get answers on dealing with this issue. It's such a complicated issue because you want to make sure that you criminalize those that are distributing and trying to find the chemicals and changing the compound to the drug so that it stops. And at the same time, you know that this disproportionately affects communities of color. And I represent an area which is a majority-minority community, and I know that they get into this prison cycle that they can't get out of, and people are punished because they have issues growing up. And Mr. Holman, as a mom, I have an 11-year-old daughter, I have a 14-year-old son. It hits close to home. And believe me when I tell you that this should not be a political issue at all. I think we all want to deal with this issue the right way. We need to make sure that we provide support services to parents that are dealing with children that are experimenting. I was just reading that the easiest way to now purchase fentanyl is online. There was an investigative committee in the Senate, actually, that found that there are 6 online sellers. People can purchase these drugs online. And what are we doing in Congress to make sure that we provide the appropriate oversight to stop that? So I don't think that allowing for fentanyl to extend the Schedule I is going to be an issue. I think that many members in the House agree that we have to do that right now. But at the same time, there has to be a way that even though we provide that extension, we can still do research. So I wanted to ask first to Ms. Comer, do you think that there is a process in place for an institution that can conduct research into the health benefits of analogs under a Schedule I drug?
There is a process in place, and it can be done. But as I wrote in my testimony, and I think we've heard earlier today, the process is really complicated and burdensome. And I know for a fact, so there are only a handful of chemists who are either willing or able to research these kinds of compounds, and they just don't want to go, apply for a Schedule I license because it's so difficult. So I think that, the things that we've been discussing this morning about ways to streamline the process are definitely in the right, direction, and ways of removing some of the substances once they get placed into Schedule I is also helpful from a research perspective. What is harder, I think, to get a handle on is the impact of this, chilling effect that it has on research. That's what is worrisome here. you know, I know that this is, as you said, it's a very complicated issue, and we want to, you know, our organization, me personally, you know, I understand the DEA's concerns about prosecuting these people. You know, it's when I first found out that fentanyl was hitting the streets, I was shocked and I was really dismayed because I worked with it when I was in graduate school, and I know that the dose that produces a euphoric effect and the dose that produces, you know, that's deadly is so small. And then when I heard that carfentanil hit the street, I was even more shocked. So, you know, we need to do something, and I think having this kind of dialogue is critical.
Thank you, Ms. Kumar. I wanted to ask Professor Ciccarone, if that's the way to pronounce it, right? Yeah. If you could explain the prominence of fentanyl and analogs that are used now among minority populations.
The main thing to be aware of that on the street level, folks cannot tell the difference in what they're getting. So there's no cultural lingo for fentanyl. There's not a lot of slang for it, which says that it's not a drug of choice. It is a contamination in the heroin stream. So people are looking for heroin, but what they're getting is fentanyl and other analogs. The problem with the analogs is they come across as a great range of potencies, from 3 times morphine to 10,000 times morphine. So those vicissitudes alone and the clandestine nature of the contamination is what's causing overdose, right? There's no way to level that out. There's no way that this ban will make the streets safer in terms of fentanyl vicissitudes. We see that fentanyl is still there, despite 15 months of the emergency scheduling. Let me just point out that all the fentanyl that comes into this country could fit into 10 industrial drum barrels right between your dais and this table. All of it in the country right here. How do we stop that with the enormous Pacific Rim trade? You know, thousands of container ships that happen across the Pacific Ocean. How do we stop 10 industrial barrels worth of product, right? Interdiction itself is a problem. Source control might have opportunity, working with China, working with Mexico to stop the production of substance. But by the time we get to the street level, putting the genie back in the bottle ain't happening. It's just not.
Thank you. And just one last word, Mr. Holman, if there's anything you would like to tell parents that are dealing with this issue, what would you recommend?
The not my child thought process doesn't work. It doesn't matter what demographic you are, who you are, where you're at. Anyone could be affected. You know, I don't know. That's why I'm here. We need a solution.
And we'll work together on that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I would like to thank the witnesses for your time today. And just before we conclude, I agree with Ms. Mercarcel-Powell that I know that we will extend the ban. But at some point in our country, I hope that we have the political will to force China and Mexico to stop manufacturing. We put tariffs, we stop Mexico or threaten Mexico around the border, but yet we can't figure out a way to get them to stop the manufacturing. I hope one day that we have the political will to stop the pharmaceutical industry from excessive manufacturing. We don't hold them accountable. And to stop online sales. And I hope one day that we have the political will in this country to provide multiple modalities of treatment instead of doing what gives us a false sense of responding by locking folks up who are lower level drug dealers and missing the big kingpins that traffic or the manufacturing. And with that, we're adjourned.